G'day, Pastor Blake here. Thanks so much for watching this message today. I pray that this sermon and resource would help grow you in your relationship with Jesus, also in conjunction with a local church. If you have any questions about our church, you can head to our website, devonportcoc.com.au. Again, thanks for watching this message today, and I do hope that it blesses you in your love and devotion towards Jesus Christ.
Well, in the wake of Easter, we are preaching a short 2-week series called It's Not Over, focusing on 2 particular events after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Now, last week, Blake shared the story of 2 despondent travellers on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and how they were spiritually, emotionally, and physically turned around by an encounter with the risen Christ. Because hope was not over. Today we're going to explore another interesting story told only in the Gospel of John in chapter 21. It's about this time after the resurrection when Jesus appears to 7 of his disciples while they're fishing. We think of this usually as Peter's story, but really it's an interplay between Peter and Jesus and some of their mutual previous experiences, which we will touch back on. Now, because John 21 is the continuation of this relationship that was already established between Jesus and Peter, we're going to go back a little way, and we're just going to kind of poke around in their history a little bit and get to know Peter. And this is going to help us connect the dots later on. Now, before we go any further, let me just clarify that Peter's given name is actually Simon. So he's Simon, son of John. And in the Bible, he's called Simon, Simon Peter, and Peter. So this morning, if I use any of those names, just know that I'm talking about the same person, just so that you don't get confused. Simon, Peter, same person. Okay. So we meet Simon Peter for the first time in the Bible before he was even called to discipleship, when he's fishing on the Sea of Galilee. He's been out fishing all night with his brother Andrew and caught nothing. 0. This guy's a professional fisherman and he's just done the night shift for no pay, no food on the table. But while Simon and Andrew are cleaning their nets the next morning after this futile night's work, Jesus is there, teaching by the lake. And he tells Simon to go back out onto the water and have another go at fishing. Like, I know you've been working all night and it's been totally unsuccessful, but just have another go. Go out there and keep trying. So Simon does, he obeys, and consequently they catch a miraculously huge haul of fish that any fisherman would be proud of at a time of the day when you wouldn't usually bother to go fishing. Jesus tells Simon, "Follow me." And on the back of that miracle, the miraculous haul of fish, Simon does. He leaves everything to become one of Jesus' disciples. And in fact, he becomes one of Jesus' closest 3 friends. Simon is passionate and strong-willed. He's a natural leader. It's Simon who has the spiritual revelation and blurts out to Jesus, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," recorded in Matthew 16. And from there, Jesus renames him Peter, Petros, meaning rock, and tells him that he will be a founding father of the church. And over those 3 years of ministry alongside Jesus, Peter hears all the messages. He gets the inside scoop on the meaning of the parables. He sees all the miracles. He's one of Jesus' most trusted friends. But when his faith is on the line on that dark night of Good Friday, he fails spectacularly. And he denies 3 times that he even knows Jesus. He is not my friend. He is not my rabbi. He is not my Lord. From the Son of God's inner circle to massive failure, Peter is so relatable. He is so much like us. But Peter's failure is not the end of his story. Today's passage in John 21 happens approximately 2 to 5 weeks after the resurrection, somewhere in that window. So we're going to be reading from John 21, verse 1. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realise that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Now this is starting to sound a little bit familiar. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "Oh, it is the Lord." So they had the realization. This very familiar sounding meeting with Jesus is the 3rd time that he appeared to a group of the disciples after the resurrection. And just like on the road to Emmaus from last week, the disciples don't immediately recognise that it's him. Now, collectively, since Jesus' arrest, they have been disloyal, confused, and fearful. But at least now they do seem to believe that he has indeed risen from the grave. So how will Jesus respond in light of Peter's recent failure and denial? Spoiler alert, their relationship is not over, because failure doesn't have to be final. Failure doesn't have to be final. Take a look at how Jesus comes to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee, because this is also how he comes to us. It's not over. Jesus comes when we are at a loss. The disciples are in limbo. They're waiting in Galilee because Jesus told them to, but they don't even know what for. Peter has reverted back to a more certain time in his life. He's gone fishing, but even that doesn't work. He's had a disappointing night and he has this unresolved issue from disowning his faith. He's all over the place. That's when Jesus shows up. Jesus comes when we are at a loss. Jesus comes unexpectedly. We don't always realise how close he is. The disciples were chatting with him and they didn't even realise it. We might be praying for something and still not recognize straight away that Jesus is right there. He's in the conversation. He's in the middle of it. Jesus comes with care. Jesus calls to the disciples from the shore in verse 5 and he says, friends, haven't you any fish? You might have noticed that they did not give him the same courtesy in reply. Friends. To Peter, who failed him, Jesus calls him friend. Jesus comes with forgiveness and grace and care. Jesus comes with power. The one who provided that miraculous haul of fish that first triggered faith in Peter still has just as much power as he ever did. And Jesus may not be standing here in the flesh among us, but he still does miracles. He still provides. Let's keep moving through this story. The disciples in the boat have just worked out that it's Jesus on the shore. And it's interesting when you look at the different personalities of the disciples. They're in the boat, they've just had this repeat miracle, very similar to the huge catch of fish when Jesus first called some of them. And it's John who is the one who realises that it's Jesus, the thinking disciple. He's the one who puts 2 and 2 together. But Peter, well, he's a man of action. So he just jumps straight out of the boat and heads to shore. And there's Jesus, cooking breakfast, as you do when you're the resurrected Son of God. He's got a fire going, he's got some fresh bread cooking in the coals. Hey, Peter, just go grab me a few more fish to put on the fire, will you? Yeah, sure thing. In verse 12, Jesus says to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. But it just seems like they're not quite sure how to behave because there's no training for talking to a dead man who's come back to life. Now, I'm not sure if it's just me, but this feels like the most awkward breakfast meeting ever. And after breakfast, Peter and Jesus are about to head into a more private conversation. We know from verse 20 that they were no longer just sitting around the fire with everybody else. And in my imagination, just this tiny bit, in my imagination, after they've finished eating, Jesus turns to Peter and he says, walk with me, Peter. And then this actual conversation happens. John 21, verse 15. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, follow me. Now, even though many of us try to avoid it. Sometimes you've just got to have an awkward conversation in order to resolve issues and move forward. And here, the awkward conversation is the pathway to restoration. So the awkward conversation leads to restoration. Have you ever had an awkward conversation with God? I have. It's the kind of conversation where you squirm a bit because really all you want to do is justify yourself, but you know that you're talking to the God of the universe who created you and knows all of your motives. My awkward conversations with God often start with me doing all the talking. But it's when I actually choose to listen, when I allow God's Holy Spirit to reveal if there is anything in me that's causing the issue. That's when Jesus reminds me of his love and his grace and the truth. That's when we can get unstuck and move forward to reconciliation with God. Jesus doesn't shy away from awkward conversations. He's up for it. He came and he died to reconcile us to God. Like that was his purpose. But resolving an awkward conversation with God will require you to be honest. Honesty is required. You see, Peter doesn't just feel like he failed. No. No, Peter failed. Like he really failed. Big time. And it's important to acknowledge our failures to God. It's not like it's going to take him by surprise. It's actually for our benefit when we do this, when we are honest and acknowledge our failures before God. Now, Peter doesn't need to be told by Jesus that he failed. He knows that it's the truth. Luke's gospel tells us that after Jesus was arrested and taken away by the guards, there's this poignant moment where Peter and Jesus actually eyeball each other. Peter is outside the high priest's house. He's warming himself by the fire. He's cursing and denying his faith, while Jesus is inside the house waiting for the death sentence. For the third time, Peter swears and declares, "I never knew him." The rooster crows and they make eye contact. And the realization of what Peter has done just hits him. And he is a wreck. He runs away, bawling his eyes out. He knows he failed. But honesty before God is the platform from which we dive into his forgiveness. Honesty is required. So let's pull apart this awkward conversation. Firstly, Jesus says, "Do you love me more than these?" Meaning, do you love me more than the other disciples love me? Because back on the night of Jesus' arrest, but before it got difficult, Peter was full of talk. Jesus was warning the disciples that they were all going to scatter, but Peter wasn't having a bar of it. No, Peter boasted, "Even if all the others fall away, I never will." And that's when Jesus predicted Peter's threefold denial. And now they're face to face, and Jesus asks, "So Peter, do you love me more than these other guys love me?" Is it just talk? Or is there some action to go with these claims of loving Jesus? How does your Monday to Friday life stack up against your Sunday Jesus talk? But this awkward conversation has even more layers to it, because in the original language, in the Greek, there's more than one way to say love. And when Jesus said to Peter, "Do you love me?" he used the word agape. And that's an unselfish, unconditional love. That's the kind of love that God has for us. But when Peter replied, he used a different word. He used the word phileo, which means a brotherly love, a friendly affection. It's a different, slightly different meaning. So in reality, the conversation sounded a little bit more like this. Jesus says, "Do you unconditionally agape love me?" And Peter replies, "Yes, Lord, I phileo brotherly love you." Now perhaps Peter's just trying to be a little bit more realistic now, or a bit more humble. Perhaps he's saying, "Jesus, I think we've already established that my love is not unconditional. It's weak, and I struggle, but I do love you." Now, interestingly, Jesus doesn't say, "Well, that's not good enough, Peter." Jesus doesn't say that. There's no judgment. It's as though he's just glad Peter is being honest. His pride's out of the way, because Jesus has still got something really important for Peter. Feed my lambs. Jesus does not disqualify Peter for being a work in progress. And that is great news for us. In fact, Jesus tasks Peter with the continuation of his own ministry. Feed my lambs. The second time Jesus says, "Do you unconditionally agape love me?" Again, Peter replies the same way. "Yes, Lord. You know, I phileo, I brotherly love you. Take care of my sheep." Another important shepherding role given to Peter, not on the back of false bravado, but because of honesty and humility. But here comes the stinger. On the third occasion, Jesus asks, "Do you phileo, brotherly love me? Do you actually love me the way you say you love me?" No wonder Peter was hurt as Jesus downgrades the question which Peter has already answered twice. And Peter says, "Well, you know everything. You knew my heart last time when I thought that I would stand by you and you knew I was going to fail. So I phileo, I brotherly love you, Jesus, and that is all I've got." Jesus says, "Follow me, because I can show you what agape is like." Of course we can't get to agape on our own. And Jesus gives Peter an indication that his love will be stretched in the course of following Jesus all the way to death. So we have 3 denials from Peter, 3 statements of failure, 3 opportunities from Jesus to let Peter declare his love, and 3 affirmations that Jesus still wants Peter to fulfill his calling to lead the early church. Because when Jesus forgives, he forgives it all. 3 denials, 3 affirmations. It's not over. Forgiveness and redemption are available. The irony of this story is that the very moment Peter failed is the reason that Jesus died. Jesus seeks out his disciples while they're fishing and has this one-on-one conversation with Peter, just to say to that one human being, you are still really valuable to me. I know what you did. I know how you failed. I died to forgive you for that. Let's just step back through this story to show the way that Jesus forgives Peter. He wipes the slate clean, but he also redeems Peter's story. He gives his future back. Jesus doesn't ask for Peter's honesty so that he can humiliate him, but so he can reinstate him, so that Peter can lead the church knowing that he is called by Jesus to that purpose in spite of his failure. When Jesus forgives, it is a complete do-over. He can just go back and start again. And Jesus goes back to the beginning. He finds Peter fishing. And then he reveals himself through the same miracle that prompted Peter's faith to start with, the huge haul of fish. In a gentle but truthful way, Jesus calls Peter by his original name. Not Petrus. He doesn't call him Peter, the rock. He goes back to calling him Simon, son of John. Let's start afresh. Jesus had correctly predicted that Peter would disown him 3 times, but he doesn't want Peter to wallow in the grief of his failure. He gives him 3 opportunities to wipe out the denials with declarations of love. He then uses the very same words that changed Peter's life when he was fishing 3 years earlier to confirm without a doubt that his original calling to discipleship still stands. Follow me. Now, none of this repetition would have been lost on Peter, as Jesus also tasks him with care for the early church. Complete forgiveness. Absolute redemption. So what happened next to Peter? Would history repeat itself when his faith was tested after Jesus had ascended to heaven? You know, Jesus offers all of us forgiveness, but we have to choose to walk in it. It's not over from God's point of view. He doesn't give up on us. But if you want forgiveness and redemption, you have to take him up on it. If you're interested in the turnaround from Peter's fearful denial to becoming a fearless, rock-solid believer, follow up today by reading Acts chapter 2. Only God, through the ministry of Jesus and the empowerment of his Holy Spirit, can bring about that kind of change.